and then we'll engage in a conversation for a little bit, and then we're going to open it up so that we can all have that. I am pleased to introduce first Margari Hill. Margari Hill is the co-founder and executive director of Muslim Anti-Racism Collaborative, Muslim ARC, a human rights education organization, and future strategy content developer at Fresh Pulp magazine. She's also a freelance writer and published in How We Fight White Supremacy in 2018, Time, Huffington Post, and Al Jazeera English. She earned her master's degree in history of the Middle East and Islamic Africa from Stanford University in 2006. Her research includes transformations in Islamic education, colonial resistance among West Africans in Sudan during the earlier 20th century, inter-ethnic relations in Muslim communities, anti-bias K-12 education, and the criminalization of Black Muslims. She's on the board of Black Muslim Girl Fly, the advisory council of Inkerij, I-N-K-E-R-I-J, I don't know if I said that incorrectly, okay. AAF advisor for Vigilant Love, advisory council for Muslim Youth Camp, and advisory to the Islam, Social Justice, and Interreligious Engagement Program at the Union Theological Seminary, and serves on numerous coalitions advancing the causes for marginalized communities. For her work, she has received numerous awards, including Stanford's 2022 MACA Award, the Council of American Islamic Relations 2020 Muslim of the Year Award, Khadija bin Walid Relief Foundation Lifetime Humanitarian Award in 2019, Big Heart Award in 2017, MPAC's 2015 Changemaker Award, and she has given many talks and workshops at various universities and community centers throughout her career. Let's give a round of applause for Margari Hill. And then joining her as well is Davis Rodríguez Meléndez. Davis Rodríguez Meléndez is from Puerto Rico and currently resides in San Diego, California, where he is a psychotherapist serving the LGBTQAI plus communities, Spanish and Portuguese speaking communities. He has been in the field of social work and community advocacy for over 25 years. He's currently pursuing a doctorate in social work. His topic of study is identity, intersectionality on Afro-Latino queer men and social work practice. He's expected to complete this program this summer. A round of applause. He's completing this summer. In addition, Davis obtained a master's degree in Spanish and has been a Spanish and Latin American professor at Temple University, Rutgers University. He is also a graduate and accredited trainer for the Center for Playback Theater. He incorporates playback theater practice into his clinical work and other settings, focusing on race, identity, sexuality, gender, diversity, and immigrant populations. In addition to playback training and practices, he's trained in classical theater and psychodrama. Let's give a round of applause for Davis. I'm going to sit so I can join this conversation and so that we can engage in this talk. So thank you all so much for, again, joining this panel, joining this conversation. It's really, what we wanted to do is that it's not necessarily a conversation on the film like we shared, right? But it's more, the film is one aspect of a Black community, right? One slice, Black Latinos here in the U.S., the way that they dealt with their Blackness, with their spirituality. But that we all of us have a very varied experience. And sorry, let me just make sure, I don't want to, I have very specific wording on the questions. So I want to make sure we have it there. But when we were talking about what is it that we mean by faith in Black communities, we started with the James Baldwin quote I shared earlier, right? James Baldwin says in the novel No Name in the Street, it says, Black is a tremendous spiritual condition, one of the greatest challenges anyone alive can face. So can you share a personal story about how faith has shaped your life journey? And we can start with whoever wants to start.
Oh, in so many ways. Just want to make sure I'm projecting. Do we need to? Okay, yeah, this is a much stronger mic. Okay. So as a practicing, visibly Muslim, I embraced Islam when I was 18 years old in the 90s, but I grew up quote-unquote Christian. My mother's New Age. So even without organized religion, I always had this deep, abiding respect for the transcendent. I was definitely influenced by my mom, who was exploring a lot of things. There was Dianetics from all levels, crystals, everything. So I embrace all of that. But I was a Christian seeker, you know, like I was looking for different faith traditions. I really loved that. I loved Greek mythology. And in all of those traditions, especially in the 80s, like I did not see myself within those legends. Like I was not exposed in elementary school to the indigenous belief systems of my peoples. And that includes traditional animist faiths in Africa, but also the Muslim faith, which many of my ancestors come from Muslim majority regions. But in that journey, I did eventually land upon Islam as a way to tap into that transcendent, into that deep history. I had many systems of support like in that journey. My family kind of embraced Islam because it was like kind of familiar. Coming up my mother knew from New Jersey. And in my own spiritual journey, some of the things where it brought me to, which I found very beautiful in the film, was some of my experiences in Morocco, which was actually seeing on the other side a different form of the African diaspora, of seeing the convergence of the Gnawa or other religious practices of that you could see the Yoruba faith systems that we could see in the New World, where I got to see that in Morocco and the healing traditions of the people. And so that there were people that looked like me, but they spoke Darija. And they looked like even when I went my second trip to Morocco, I was with a sister. This sister looked just like me. And at first, well, Maria, she was actually Brazilian. And when we were at Middlebury, people kept confusing us. And I was like, what are you talking about? You know, we don't look alike. And then when I showed my mother the picture of Maria, my mom was like, yeah, you do look like sisters. And so, and we did. And so we ran around Morocco for a little bit. And people thought we were both Moroccan, too. So we looked just alike. She was from Brazil. I'm African American of different mixed and kind of like different heritages. So there is some like old overlap in Florida. I don't know what my great grandmother was, but we have some hints that she probably came from the Iberian Peninsula. So, but having that kind of connection, and then when we went to Fez and having that experience, and when she said, this is very similar to what we do in my culture, and seeing Black tradition, that was deeply affirming. It was deeply affirming to see that within Morocco, to see that connection with this young woman that was traveling with me, and that expanded my notion of Blackness that goes to the Middle East, to South America. I do have Afro-Caribbean roots, and so like here, even this is like deeply life-affirming of connecting and understanding the plurality of Blackness and how we could come together to support Black and faith traditions.
All right.
I don't know how I'm going to follow that up, but well, my experience, I was raised as a preacher's kid. My dad is a very conservative Pentecostal. It was an interesting experience because as I was listening, even when I watched the film, one of the things that struck me was that my dad's family came from a very Santero, Palero tradition line, and he had such hatred towards it. And he was like, that were worshiping, stay away from them people. I didn't really know a lot of my family. By the way, for context, my mom actually is like a second generation Spaniard immigrant in Puerto Rico. So she's Puerto Rican, but she's white. My dad is Black. And my dad has such a rejection. It was very visceral. So I grew up, in the church. I was always conflicted because on one hand, the message of love and what have you, but it always felt like it was in denial of myself. Like where I came from, like that was wrong, And then but I have so much love for the church that I was going to continue the family tradition and I was going to go into ministry. And then I discovered something about myself, which is my sexual orientation, and that derailed the plane. That completely derailed the train, which actually, in my experience, was, I really remember having a a meeting in which I was said, you either need to choose God or the devil. Those are your only choices. Either you follow Christ or you go into the life of perversion. And my response was, well, I choose to be myself. And that threw me into a big spin. As I was watching the film, I'm like, I did try all those religions. Yeah, I tried the Messianic Jew, and yes, I tried. And at some point, I just became agnostic. I mean, I couldn't say there's not such thing as a greater power, but I couldn't know what it was, and the way it was defined for me, that didn't quite jive. So I was just always in search of like learning, and then when I started learning the origin of Christianity, and I became introduced to Islam faith and how they're close to each other, and all of that, it just blew my mind, you know. And also talking about, there was a line in the movie, which it was the opening, which is like, we were not shipped, we were not dropped off as family units, right? And one of the things is actually when I was doing my master's at NYU. I met this girl, she and I hit it off. Like, we really, really hit it off. And she was a charismatic Pentecostal, and that was something, it was familiar and I really liked about her, you know, but we would always talk. And at one point, she used to call me primo. It's like, hey, primo, hey, and that's how we were, right? So one day I show up, my sister sees a picture, and she's like, wait, like, she looks very familiar. So I'm like, okay. So she said, well, I talked to my friend Liza, and she was like, hey, I'm going to talk to my uncle. And I was like, okay, I'm going to talk to my sister because she's a family historian. And then it turned out we were related. So I went to school for 3 years with my cousin without knowing we were cousins. And it was funny because that's how so that quote reminded me of that. And then how I identify with the blackness, the other piece is that growing up in Puerto Rico, I was black. Right? Or no, actually no. Yo era moreno, era trigueñito, no. But when I came to the United States, I wasn't. So I had to redefine, and I had to constantly argue, you know, like the only difference between your ancestor and my ancestor, we were dropped off, you know, but again, so it was a constant. However, so where am I today? Today I'm a practicing Buddhist, but yeah, I do cherish and I do want to understand. I really want to, to share spirit. Like, that's more my approach. And yeah, that would be my bio.
Yeah, no, lived experiences are very important for us. Like I said in the opening statements, right? Frantz Fanon says that, right? Like, the lived experience of the black person is the evidence and essence of blackness. And I think that that's always important. So let me ask you now, and maybe we'll go this way now, David, so you go first. So, our lived experiences take us to different places for spirituality and religious identity, spiritual identity, faith identities. How do you, in your work, how do you utilize faith or spirituality in your journey in your work?
Yeah, actually, that's a very personal question. And it's actually because part of my journey, there was a time that I was like, I'm not going to go there. I'm like, not going to go with religion. I'm not going to go into spirituality. I'm just not doing that. And I was working with this young man. He was African-American. Actually, he was African-American and half Dominican. We'll never forgive him. Forget about him. So he would continue to relapse. He continued to relapse. And he tried to do the 12 steps, and he continued to relapse. And at one point, he said, can I keep it real? And I'm like, sure. And I was like, I can't. How can I surrender to a higher power that hates me? Not only am I black, but I'm a homo, And that has such an impact that I was like, wow, there is pain here, and but there can be also healing, So it doesn't have to be. So for me, how does it come across in my practice? Like that, he was actually at the pivotal point. I'm like, okay, let me go back to faith and religion and get to that, because to carry that, and that felt very familiar, very personal. We worked together for a long time, and, he went on about his life. I wonder sometimes how he's doing. And also, but life kept pushing me into different conversations. Like one time I was working with a man who was practiced Muslim, right? And we were like talking about that and the differences, and I learned so much from him, and I was so open, and we had great dialogues. I somehow You know how they say, if you want to hear God laugh, tell him your plans. You know, because that was my plan. My plan is like, I'm just going to focus on the sexual orientation and I'm going to focus on the identity, the race identity. But life kept putting me in this setting in which spirituality always came back. So for me, it became, unbeknownst to me, it became a big part of my practice with my clients and an ongoing journey.
Thank you. Wow. There's so much there to really absorb and to think about, and I'm going to carry your story and those that have been challenged, right? Is like how, when you have people of whatever age, but especially young people who are have that experience where they're like, how can I live in a world where I'm told that the Creator hates me? And what does that do psychologically to your wellness, and then that your mental wellness, and then to the body, right? And so we can see, like there is that coin, right, of whether organized religion or even if it's like how people when they interpret faith in a way that is oppressive, that does not embrace that mercy, that love. For me, as a faith-based organizer that works in an ecosystem of social justice, of trying to build capacity, that the way that I see spirituality is both infused by both the folk religions of my peoples, which is like deeply embodied. Like Black religion is both like in the voice, right? This anointed voice, it's in the movement, it's in the body, it's in honoring our ancestors, that ancestral memory. And then converging with the kind of organized faith that I have, which is I came into Islam as like very kind of like intellectual, this kind of intellectual part of Islam, and that has emerged with that Africanity of like this embodied feeling that I have, and in that way, when we bring together in doing justice work, so in my faith tradition, justice is very important. And so is this idea of taking care of those who are most vulnerable. That's how we see Rahma. So we open everything, it's just like this idea of the Rahman, which is like the beneficent, so like God's mercy on everybody regardless. And that it's about care for the human, and so like that's the ultimate unconditional love. And so like when you have Cornel West that says, justice is what love looks like in public. And so that's like what imbues my work. It's like that I have to give up certain things to make the world just, right? But also that ultimate justice. Like there's things that we're seeing in the world that we cannot ever make sense of. That this idea of vengeance, of righting that wrong, it's never going to happen. Like we can end up in this horrible cycle, but that is really ultimately for the Creator, the ultimate, transcendent, however it's like you gotta put it out in the universe. However you want to like name that, which allows me to take on like things that I've learned from teaching world religions, like which I've learned a lot, like when I was teaching world religions in the Bhagavad Gita, and it's just this idea that I just have to keep moving and doing this work, and the outcome is not for me, but I am trying to move in the world and do this work in a way that I think, that I hope in my struggle is that in a way that would be pleasing to the Creator. And that is bringing that love and that mercy for all humanity, which can be overwhelming sometimes, but it makes things much better. It makes it easier for me to do this work and to be tireless in it and to continue. So without faith, without that kind of transcendent aspect that I've drawn from other faith traditions, I would not be here. I would not have the meaning making, the things that we need most in this moment, that to heal individuals who are affected by oppression, like the hurt and the pain that we're experiencing from not being accepted, not only by society, but human interpretations of religion, but also the social issues and conflict that we're seeing in the world right now.
That's so important, and thank you so much, Margari and Davis, because one of the aspects of spirituality and religion is this transcendence, right? And for some reason it brings up, I don't know why it brings this up, maybe it's because I'm in California, I'm from Brooklyn, so, it shifts a different thing. But Octavia Butler in Parable of the Sower and Parable of the Talents, events, right? That's a new religion that is supposed to be transcendent from the current religious reality, right? That's the Earthseed religion does that, right? It's like her way, and they wanted her to stay in the traditional Christian. She's like, well, it's not working for this moment right now, and this dystopian future California that she was in. So it just brings up that, and the reason why that comes up is obviously because of the question that I'm going to ask you, which we had a really rich discussion about as we were preparing for this panel, because there is a difference, especially when we talk about transcendence, there is a difference then with what we call institutional religion, what we may refer to as institutional religion, and what we may refer to as spirituality. We are very specific that when we were mentioning for this film, for Faith and Blackness, we called it an exploration of spirituality. It's just one of the many different ways in which some people can talk about spirituality. We specifically didn't want to call it religion because we didn't want that assumption to be the case. So let me ask you both, what is the distinction for you between religion and spirituality, and how do they both converse with one another?
I think the first kind of stab at it, right, is, there is the in different dimensions of spirituality, like we can be deeply spiritual in this space. Some of the most spiritual spaces that I've been in have been multi-faith, have been where we just really hold space, whether we're collectively breathing together, whether we're collectively imagining together. That is the spirituality. But also, like, as an individual, right, it's like our individual relationship with what transcends beyond us. That in doing anti-racism work is deeply spiritual. So that is not within a kind of organized faith, organized on ritual that's passed on, or that is anointed by whether clergy or scholars. It's like this individual connection with the ineffable, with the things that we're just trying to put into metaphors with our words. So that's what I see as like the spirituality is that's the stuff that we can't even put to words, but it's the deep experience.
Well, for me, actually, I keep thinking about that, like the spirituality. And I work with images, so bear with me for a second. For me, when I think about spirituality, I think about it as a web. And if you look at a web is very well designed. Like you just take one end and you can undo it completely, right? So what I'm trying to say with that is actually, for me, spirituality is what connects us all. It's what, for example, when I took my mom to MCC, which is a LGBTQ church, non-denominational Christian church. And she left like, oh my God, I felt God in here. It was like one of the best services. That to me is a spirituality. Spirituality is when I meet with a Muslim brother or a Jewish person or whoever, and it's that connection, right? Is that dialogue? It's what brings us all together. I mean, Hinduism is to say like Brahm, right? Like, we all are different manifestation of the higher power. That to me is a spirituality. Religion, on the other, I go back and forth with that one, because religion, the way I would organize religion, the way I would see it, it will be kind of like one of the many conduits to pass that message. I think that I grew up in a church in which like people will come together, for one another, right? But then there is this hierarchical. I think about spirituality as a web, but to me, I see like organized religion as a hierarchical entity, which is from top to bottom. And yes, traditions are passed, and story and tradition and cultural preservation, a lot of come from, there's an interconnectivity with that. But at the same time, it's such a top to bottom. Like, at the end of the day, someone is up here and someone has to be down here, right? And somebody's not worthy, and somebody's receiving the favor of being like safe if you choose that path. However, so for me, again, going to spirituality, spirituality is actually, for me, it comes like what brings us all together. Like, I mean, somehow, somewhere, we were all going to be here today. And I believe that, right? So, whereas in organized religion, to me, is more of a political institution. It does have great things, you've seen it, but at the same time, it is used for control when it's in the wrong hands, for lack of a better word.
Yeah, and I think that's important to highlight because in religious, the distinction between spirituality and religion, or faith and religion, is because in black communities, and you've seen this in your research, I've seen it in different communities that I've visited, obviously in different Afro-Latino communities, spirituality is always present. Spirituality is always present, whether it's codified as a religion is a thing, right? And I remember a conversation that happened around the Rastafarians that was just recently in Barbados. And then we have one more question, then we want to open it up to everyone. So please, if you have any questions, I was just recently in Barbados, very interesting religious history, very interesting spiritual history in Barbados. But one of the things there, actually, they were talking about how people were refusing to acknowledge Rastafarianism as a religion because it didn't meet the traditional Western definitions of a religion of like, it needs to have X thing and X thing and X thing. And the people that I spoke with, they were like, yeah, but Rastafarians are really spiritual. Like, this is, again, in the context of Barbados, so it's different than would be everywhere else. And that was such an interesting conversation because I think that's sometimes the distinction, right? Religion sometimes has to fit a specific definition. Spirituality doesn't have to fit that definition. It broadens the definition. I love the idea that you thought of it, Webb. So let's ask one last question. Let's bring everyone else into this conversation. The last question is based on that, right? There's this distinction between spirituality and religion, right? Faith and religion. Faith and spirituality, I think someone could use almost simultaneous, or there's differences there, but let's use them for the purpose of this conversation as almost co-equal. So there's a difference. What do you think? How have you seen in the black communities that you both participate, how have you seen black faith and spirituality used as a tool for black liberation?
So I think, in multiple ways. From many African American Muslims, actually many Muslims of all races. So even you have we have a scholar, Suhaib Webb, and he's white, he's Nordic white, and for some reason, my ex-husband, who is actually from a Afro-Caribbean background, they would just think they were related, and I was like, they don't look anything alike, they're just tall. But Suhaib Webb, who's very Nordic, he is influenced by Malcolm X, and so you could kind of see, the influence of Malcolm X, who's very influential in liberation theology. So it's Dr. Crone, who wrote Black Liberation Theology, was influenced by Malcolm X. In many ways that I see the understanding, right, even in liberation struggles and anti-colonial struggles, right, or in these moments of life or death, right, giving birth, whether you have the doulas and midwives that are bringing in life, right, it's for me, that was the closest I felt to God, because I was it was really, it was pretty harrowing. And then in transitioning, right, out of life and supporting families through that is also, that's where we have our chaplains, that's where we have our people to help guide us through these life transitions. And in these moments, right, when we're thinking about just oppression and where a society tells you you are not an acceptable human being. That's what I was taught as a little girl. The first time I remember I was probably 4 years old, and there were two missionaries. And now when I think about the vague image that I have, I think they probably were, they were kind of ambiguous in some ways, but they told me and my sister that when we would go to heaven, that God would burn off all of our skin so we could be white like them. And I knew something was wrong with their faith, because I was look, I knew I was cute, I just knew who I was back then. And it took some process over time, some conditioning to tell me, where I started to believe what other people told me about myself. It was in really embracing a faith tradition where I no longer had to open up a Bible where God was looked blonde, God and Jesus were the blondest people, looked nothing like me or anybody in my family. And believe me, we have a range, but to embrace something that's transcendent, like to not have to have a monotheistic religion where even those early Muslims were of various races and backgrounds, that somebody looked like me was there in that moment and helped to pass on something that is so big and broad. I started to understand that history that I had that predated slavery, but also connects me, right, to so many people. So in embracing being taught by, reading about Malcolm X, but then also connecting outside of that was deeply liberatory to me and helped me root my Blackness, embrace my African heritage, and then also embrace the heritage of other people, whether they're from Central Asia, whether they were Bosnians in Europe, whether they were Hindus in Nepal. All of these kind of histories that I've learned through that time has been like just liberatory. Like I believe I have been on this journey towards an integrative anti-racist identity because of my faith, and that allows me to embrace my full self and embrace other people of various backgrounds and to uplift their histories and be transformed in every encounter. So I hope that kind of,
I don't know how to follow that up. Actually, I feel it was very on point. What I will do, how have I seen it change, or where do I see it? There was actually a study a couple months ago. I don't know if you guys remember, in which, how we talk about generational curves. How we go, like usually youth go to the opposite direction of where the older generation is, but then eventually kind of goes back. And there was actually a poll and actually a research on religion, Christianity particularly. And then like Generation Z was the one that actually was like, no, it's not having the same curve, it's like going back to tradition, right? So and the label was secular, right? And we were talking about that over lunch, right? But in reality is, what I'm excited about is like the whole anti-racist ideology, now that we know that people that look like me, that the younger generation know that people that look like us are part of that history. Somehow we were omitted, but we're coming back. I would just add a little bit, I don't mean to plug this in because it's my doctorate, but in reality, because I work with Black queer community, right? I grew up in an age in which if somebody who was saying that as a queer person I was going to go to hell, it was the same person that would make a pass at me. And then there would be another pastor saying, well, sometimes the devil, you need to pray more because the devil can utilize you, to tempt or, right? To this generation, that is like, no, we're denouncing this stuff. Like, no, we're not gonna put up with that. We're gonna denounce it, we're gonna talk about it, we're gonna scream about it. And yeah, it comes to, that's how faith interconnects to my work, that I see that. And I'm like, wow, like people are speaking up more, and we are claiming our identity, not just, in my work, is actually not just as African, but also as queer within that narrative. So I don't need that answered.
No, yeah, I think it's important. And I think just because faith and spirituality, and we want to take comments, questions from anyone here, so please feel free to just raise your hand and we'll take your comments. But just a last thought, I think is very important, because I think as we think about Black liberation struggles globally, right, like I consider myself a Pan-Africanist, and that's the kind of understanding that I have to my connection with the diaspora. Spirituality has always been a part of that movement, whether in the continent of Africa, right? There's two different versions of Pan-Africanism. There's the continent of Africa Pan-Africanist movement, and there's the broader diasporic Pan-Africanist movement. And both of those movements are very spiritual in diverse ways, very faith-based, very spiritual, very grounded in different traditions. And I think that is a way for us, and you see that, and we see that as we're moving forward with younger folks. Even, there's another research that I pointed out. I saw a hand over here, but there's a research that pointed out that shows just how the different numbers, especially for Black young folk, believing spirituality and like their spiritual beliefs versus non-Black folk, and just how deeper spirituality they have even coming up. So I think that's